Today's Torah portion doesn't go in sync with the normal parshiot for this week, and that's because today is technically the 8th day of Pesakh. So most of you may know Pesakh is a week-long observance, and we had a fabulous Seder last week, and Doug did an amazing job, as he always does, connecting Pesakh to Messiah. So I'm not going to address that today, but I do want to address a few traditions of Pesakh. So we pick up in chapter 16, just a couple verses. You shall slaughter the Passover sacrifice for the lamb, for the Lord your God. You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days, therefore, you shall eat unleavened bread. Well, there are 2 points I want to point out here. Highlighted there, I've highlighted leavened and 7. Now, the leavened bread or grains, I don't want to spend too much time on, but for those of you familiar with the Ben David website, if you go to the sermons list, on April 1st, 2017, Chuck did a great sermon on that, and he went into detail about it. I think it's called Passover Preparations. Went into the chametz and everything, so to learn a little bit more about that, please check that out. But I do want to address it just a little bit here. Mainly a topic, he also briefly addressed kitniot. Now, kitniot is literally translates legumes, and it's a more broader term to refer to a group of foods that some Jews prohibit during Pesach and some don't, and it's a pretty debated issue. Now, the 2 big main groups are Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews. And technically, there are other classifications, smaller groups. The Falasha Jews from Ethiopia, Yemeni Jews don't technically fall under those categories. But the 2 main big categories are Ashkenazi Jews, which are generally from Eastern, Central Europe, as most of you may know, and Sephardi Jews, which are generally from Western, Southern Europe, and even Latin America. And anybody know why? The Spanish expulsion from Europe, a lot of Sephardi Jews came to Latin America, and there are communities all throughout Mexico, big communities in Argentina. And so the Sephardi Jews actually allow this kitniot, this classification of foods. And the reason why, the Ashkenazi Jews, generally the Orthodox community, don't permit them. And the reason for that is traditionally, it wasn't as though the foods themselves were not permissible. But to take more precaution, because they're grains, they were sometimes intermixed with other grains that were leavened. Some of the oats, whether they were in their homes or in a market. So to avoid any type of mixing of that, they just prohibited a lot of the foods. Those foods are generally beans, rice, corn, lentils. Now, as somebody who's of Mexican ethnicity, to be politically incorrect at the expense of overgeneralizing, this is, for the most part of our daily diet. So it makes it a little bit easier during Pesach to not have to refrain from some things. In fact, we rely a little bit more on these foods for that. Thank you. But interestingly, even among the Ashkenazi Jews, there are, within the conservative and reform movements, some exceptions. So I want to draw your attention to this article from the Smithsonian Magazine. It's cut off there from 2016. Yeah, it is up there. Entitled, "For the First Time in 800 Years, Rice and Beans Are Kosher for Passover. The Jewish conservative movement relaxes a 13th century ban on rice, corn, and beans during Passover." So reading just a portion of the article. "For vegans, it was really a matter of not having protein for 8 days," Rabbi Elliot Dorff, the chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, tells Goldberg. He co-authored the new rule with Levine. "This may be a big change for some Jews, but others will shrug and pass the rice and hummus along at the Seder as they would any other year. While Ashkenazi Jews, who are mostly of Eastern European descent, have long avoided kitniot during Passover. Sephardic Jews, who are often from from Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and the Middle East, have never followed this rule," Goldberg writes. And as a growing percentage of American Jews are Sephardic, the 2 cultures are starting to mix more frequently. "My daughter married a guy whose family is Moroccan," Rabbi Neil Cooper, who was Ashkenazi, tells Shofim. So at the first Seder she goes to, they have rice, and they have hummus, and they have all this stuff. So she converted to Sephardi. Still, the new ruling is not an edict. Conservative Jews will be allowed to either dig into the rice and beans or skip them as usual during Passover. That's again taken from a Smithsonian article. Now, I can actually relate to this a little bit, not on necessarily a religious aspect, but also on a cultural food aspect. As many of you may know, my wife, who's not here right now, she is about as ethnically Southern, Anglo-Nordic heritage as one can be. And so when we were first married, she was exposed to a lot of the homemade Mexican dishes that I would cook and prepare and the ingredients. So we kid around that she's converted to being Mexican now. So I can kind of relate to that. The other thing I want to point out here is in the top right, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Some of you may remember I've mentioned him a few times when I've been up here. He's actually was one of my professors at the University of Judaism. And anything conservative Judaism related, he's pretty much one of the authorities of it, which is why he co-authored this rule. So it was really interesting learning from him and the perspective of Jewish argumentation. And so speaking of that school, when I was there, we would observe Shabbos. We would recognize and keep Shabbat. Well, how many people know when Shabbat technically ends? Saturday night, approximately about an hour after sunset. But technically, it's an hour after sunset only because the actual tradition is that it ends when you can visibly see 3 stars in the sky. And that indicates the nighttime. Well, depending on where you are in the world or what season it is, even tonight maybe it looks a little bit overcast. It's difficult to know when those stars are out there. So the default is to approximate about an hour after sunset so that you fully observe it. So much like some of the Ashkenazis don't eat kitniot, on Shabbat there's an compensation for observing the Shabbat. So we would kid sometimes over on the campus. Technically, you could extend it an hour or 2 hours, and we would joke, technically, who has to end Shabbat, right? You can just stay on Shabbat forever. So in that same vein, that same tradition, the other portion of Scripture that we read, for 7 days thereafter you shall eat leavened bread. Well, why does it say 7 days, but today is technically the 8th day of Pesach? Well, in the same sense of compensating for observing, actually, in Israel, they do observe 7 days of Pesach. Everywhere else, generally outside of Israel, was known as the diaspora, it's 8 days. And again, the reason for that is more of an ancient custom that thousands of years ago, when there wasn't a set, well, this is one of the commentaries on it. There are a few other reasons why some people speculate, but a few thousand years ago, when there weren't set calendars, it was difficult to know when the new lunar month began. And so the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem would come to a consensus, this is the day that the new moon is, and there's a new month. And that word would get out to the radius of Israel. Well, as news traveled, it would become less and less reliable. So outside of the land of Israel, generally speaking, they erred on the side of keeping an extra day in case there was some miscalculation or misunderstanding of that. Obviously, today we have calendars, we can keep time, and we understand when that is. But that tradition still stands, which is why today technically is the 8th day of Pesach. Just a closing thought, going back to the kitniot, my wife yesterday was kidding around, or not, she was pretty serious. She said, I'm looking forward to tomorrow having my coffee with my favorite pan dulce, if you guys know what that is. It's a Mexican bread, a sweet bread that has flour and definitely has leaven in it. So she's looking forward to that tomorrow morning.